This is the last video script in the series that I've produced. So this is with Mazloe and Bruner. Now, I don't know how best to profile this. I'm not going very deeply into either one of these researchers, but their presence is online, and it's so easy to get current information from them that's actually better than I can give you, because they understand their field much better than I do. But there are a few things I want to point out to you, especially those that have to do with how the gospel fits into this. Now, I've reproduced Maslowe's hierarchy pyramid, and you'll notice that the basic needs that people have are at the very bottom, and it's only as needs are met moving up through the pyramid that they can address the higher needs. And you should look to see at what level you could start teaching the gospel, because you'll find very often, if they're worried about where they're going to sleep tonight, they're really not going to listen to the instructions of the gospel. They need help, and they need to be ministered to, and they need an intervention. But this will give you an opportunity to analyze your learner, the person for whom you want to create a targeted intervention, and take into account where they are at this particular time. Now, an example of this, Brigham Young, in the early days in Utah, or always has said, it's better to feed the Indians than to fight them. And the Mormon pioneers went to a lot of trouble, even down into Sanpete County, and farmed with the Utes in order to help them begin to be able to feed and care for themselves. And then they were able to talk with them about the more important things of the gospel. The other example, but there's so many, but the other one that was so significant to me was that right after the ending of the Second World War, the church sent train car loads of food to Germany under the direction of Brother Ezra Taft Benson. And the United States government also, there and in Japan, made a knowing, deliberate effort to feed and clothe and shelter and give medical care to those who had been their enemies. That is what characterizes Americans. Okay, you know what was happening in Germany on the Russian side of the line? They were dismantling the German factories, taking that and their railroad cars and everything they could, and hauling them back to Russia, along with a large number of German men who were taken there, and many of them were still there in 1948 and 49, even though the war ended in 1945. The Russians just casually said, well, they're paying off their war reparations. So when I tell you this about what America does, you really need to capture an idea of what American values are. Because at that particular time, we were almost the only ones espousing them in some kind of an active way. And of course now, those values are probably no longer called American values, because they are being found throughout the world. And charity is an act of grace that is given by many, many peoples today. But at the time, it was considered highly unusual that we would give that sort of service to those who had been our enemies. But the idea was to save the children, to keep their minds from being damaged by malnutrition, to keep their souls from being damaged by being left alone and abandoned. And there was plenty of that going on, but there was a lot that we were trying to do to mitigate those circumstances. And it was a conscious or an unconscious application of Maslow's hierarchy of human needs that was being addressed there. They said that after a while you could tell who the Latter-day Saint Germans were because they were, their complexion was good, they were healthy, they had energy, they were eating the wheat and things that were being shipped. Anyway, that's available to you, and you might want to look into it. Maslow's hierarchy can be compared with levels in Fisher's skill theory. In other words, as the ability to think emerges and is consolidated and gets more complex, so do the hierarchy of needs. And there are just several hierarchies here that interrelate to each other if you'll just use non-local integration out of your scholarship skills to pull these things together and compare them and to see how it informs your work. Now, I'll put this into a thumbnail, but going to Bruner now, the following material is found online at Simply Psychology, and there's a link below where you can get what Bruner was about. Bruner was another theorist researcher whose work relates to Vygotsky, Piaget, not immediately to Fisher because Bruner was generally before his time. But they're all of the same general school of those who have studied cognitive development in humans. That means thinking in humans. Not just in children, as I hope you're aware by now, but also in mature minds that have not yet benefited from the educational interventions designed to help them discover and actualize the inherent capacity of their mind-brain complex. And Feuerstein will give you examples of how they came to learn that was what was needed, and that's what could be done. One thing to bear in mind, these scholars are not as interested in education as they were in the manners of thinking, that is, cognition, and how it develops in humans over time. We're interested in that too, but it's only a part of our quest. The reason we are studying them, these scholars and researchers, is we know that holding the elements of some cultural values in our minds, where they can be examined and worked on by the tools available, is a function of age, mind-brain complex maturity, engagement with stimulating material, and expert guidance from the environment. So all of these things are needed to be truly effective as a master interventionist. And if you'll just take these things and look at the record, you'll find that they are being used not just by the Savior, but by other great teachers also. Trying to overteach only leads to failure. We need to target our interventions. We're depending on them to give us ideas on how to go about this. Them refers to these researchers. But we know in the end that no one has gone before us to attempt this in this way. In the last analysis, our work together is absolutely unique at this time in this way and terribly important. My wife and I were talking again yesterday, counting the number of grandchildren who have walked away from the church, just no longer believing, if they ever did. We'll do anything and everything we can to help them find their way back. Now, Bruner emphasizes thinking as the major outcome of cognitive development. This is characterized by other scholars as a joint venture effort between the learner and the environment, and that's what we base our justification for creating interventions. They are not going to develop alone. They need assistance. We want to give the very best assistance that we can, that we're capable of. Bruner says, as quoted by MacLeod, from experience, generic coding systems that permit one to go beyond the data, that is, the raw stream of reality that impacts our five senses, to new and possibly fruitful predictions. So to Bruner, important outcomes of learning include not just the concepts, categories, and problem-solving procedures invented previously by the culture, but also the ability to invent these things for oneself. And this ties back into Sternberg, who's saying intelligence is living intelligently in the world in which you live, understanding it and knowing how to do things better and finding new ways for yourself. Cognitive growth involves an interaction between basic human capabilities and culturally invented technologies that serve as amplifier of these capabilities, and that's quoting MacLeod. Just another way of saying that our environment can greatly enhance our capacity to think and to guide our actions. Again, the fully articulated human mind is a joint venture project between the learner and his or her environment. I hope by now you're sophisticated enough in this material to discern immediately that he is saying what Fisher said about the power of literate practices: amplification, non-local integration, systemic analysis, and how the emergence of these intellectual tools have helped human intelligence expand exponentially in acquiring and increasing human knowledge. And those intellectual tools must also have plus writing. It's such an important part of this intellectual process. Bruner isn't just talking about electronic devices. He wants to focus, as Hall does, on specific cultural elements that guide human thinking. Hall told you that your culture is your window on the world, and that the character you display in your life is strongly culturally patterned. Byrne and others have described for you how culture works even at the level of daily conversations in human interactions. Quoting again, the aim of education should be to create autonomous learners. And that would be exactly what Feuerstein says. People who can learn on their own. Yes, it's a joint venture, but the idea is to help them acquire and internalize those systems and tools for thinking so that they can think independently. We should say it rather, a person whose knowledge and character is rooted in the culture of godliness, possesses a fully articulated human mind, having an enlightened Christian conscience, prepared to establish the society of Enoch and Melchizedek, and to prepare a safe environment where we can welcome and serve more fully in the process of teaching for the millennial child. Remember, the title of the whole website is Teaching for the Millennial Child. But that doesn't mean teaching in their behalf as much as it means teaching that will support the emergence and stabilization of the millennial child. You're acquiring access to many powerful tools to enlighten your understanding of the world around you. I counsel you to seek elaboration of these things by the Spirit through consecration, obedience, sacrifice, and godly inspired charity and diligent effort. There's little more I can do for you now. I give you these things as my legacy. And I have said before, I have no worldly goods, nor power, nor influence, but as Peter said at the gates of the temple to the crippled man, such as I have, give I unto thee. Now may the Lord bless you and multiply your skills and righteous influence in these many vital things. And that was dated March 7th, 2019, February 5th, 2022, and today it's about February 13th, so that gives you some idea of just how long I've been engaged in this. Now, we have to avert ourselves for a minute here before we quit. Bruner's three modes of representation. Modes of representation are the way in which information or knowledge are stored and encoded in memory. We represent them in our mind-brain complex and save them there. It says rather than neat age-related stages like Piaget, the modes of representation are integrated and only loosely sequential as they translate into each other. So another way of saying this is that this process is messy. It's not coldly logical and highly structured, but it does have structure and it does have logic. And this is something you should be aware of. Anyway, the first mode that Bruner talks about is inactive, E-N-A-C-T-I-V-E. And he says that it first appears from 0 to 1 year old. He'll also mention that all of these are found later also in the more mature mind. But this appears first. It involves encoding action-based information and sorting it in our memory. For example, in the form of movement as a muscle memory, a baby might remember the action of shaking a rattle. The child represents past events through motor responses, i.e., an infant will shake a rattle which has just been removed or dropped, as if the movements themselves are expected to produce the accustomed sound. And this is not just limited to children. Many adults can perform a variety of motor tasks, typing, sewing a shirt, operating a lawnmower, that they would find difficult to describe in iconic, that is picture, or symbolic, that is word form. Now, iconic appears around ages 1 through 6. This is where information is stored visually in the form of images, a mental picture in the mind's eye. For some this is conscious, others say they don't experience it. This may explain why, when we are learning a new subject, it is often helpful to have diagrams or illustrations to accompany the verbal information, because it helps us symbolize it. And I'm very, what is it that I like to say I am? Well, can't remember. But I like to manufacture in my mind little stories that explain things. And I think that has an application here, but I won't bore you with the details. And then symbolic becomes 7 years onward. This develops last. It is where information is stored in the form of a code or a symbol, such as language. This is the most adaptable form of representation, where actions and images have a limited relation to that which they represent. Dog is a symbolic representative of a single class. Symbols are flexible in that they can be manipulated, ordered, classified, and so on. So the user isn't constrained by actions or images. In the symbolic stage, knowledge is stored primarily as words, mathematical symbols, or in other symbol systems. I think you can begin to see how important it is to help a person, whether they're a child or an adult, develop these capacities in their mind. It's just one more thing that you can incorporate into your interventions to be sure in your teaching that you're addressing these things so that people can learn with these things. Language is important for the increased ability to deal with abstract concepts. Now, an abstraction is something that you just hold in your mind. It may very well not have an actual representation out in the real world. It's something that has been constructed, and Bruner argues that language can code stimuli and free an individual from the constraints of dealing only with appearances to provide a complex yet flexible cognition. The use of words can aid the development of the concepts they represent and can remove the constraints of the here and now concept. Bruner views the infant as an intelligent and active problem solver from birth, with intellectual abilities basically similar to those of the mature adult. For Bruner, the purpose of education is not to impart knowledge, but instead to facilitate a child's thinking and problem-solving skills, which can then be transferred to a range of situations. Specifically, education should also develop symbolic thinking in children, and Feuerstein, I believe, would agree with this. He wanted to increase people's thinking and problem-solving skills that they could use in any subject matter and any situation. Recently, this is sort of a summary of this whole thing. Recently, we've been asked to write a spiritual will as an adjunct to our temporal will. The idea being to make sure we pass on our spiritual legacy to our posterity along with our temporal property. I had to smile. I just spent 10 months of steady work, 4 or 5 hours a day, often 7 days a week, to compile this study guide to preserve for my posterity the learning of my lifetime. Now I've added my stories and art. I feel that good that this will not all be lost when I am gone. It says I'm going on 18 months on this project, and that was in April 2019. What is it now? Almost April 2022. So when I tell you I've been at this for 4 or 5 years, I really have. It's just taken that long for me to comprehend and then to illustrate these things. I feel the Lord has given me a treasure of knowledge in answer to my inquiry over the years. I've always had a great curiosity to know how things work, and I've always asked the Lord to help me understand how things were intended to work during our mortal probation. How does it work, Lord? How is life intended to work? I learned much. It's been a treasure to me. I hope it will be of use to some of my posterity. The material covered here is drawn from 8 major knowledge domains, plus some very important and useful concepts and theories about how the human mind is designed to evolve during our mortal lifespan. A knowledge domain represents an entire academic discipline, such as thinking skills theory, the development of moral values, the nature of intelligence, the nature of culture, and how it affects our personality and life experience. For the most part, the academics and researchers that present their theories in these pages do not believe in God as we know him. This weakens their theories, and I have taken considerable pains to expand and elaborate the implication of their work in terms of the gospel of Jesus Christ. I've also attempted to arrange the presentation of this material in a professional. I was once, in another life, an educator. The MED by my name is Master's Degree in Education from Brigham Young University. The device called a concept learning sequence is that you present things in the order that the learner is prepared to receive them. You make sure that they're ready for what you're about to teach. You ask yourself, what does my reader need to already know, but you can then understand this next concept? What prior learning will aid them to perceive the referent under discussion? And I'm saying here I recommend you start with part 1, Hall. When I did the videos, I didn't start with Hall. I started with Fisher. That's because Fisher's been the most difficult for people to get a handle on, and I thought I better just get it down and get it elaborated as much as I could so that my learners can go back then and bring that material with them as they study these other things like Hall and the others. In this day and age of easy online access to practically everything, you'll find better and more up-to-date material in each domain by simply Googling the references or the author's name. Now, we still have this question: how can we support our posterity so they can become weeds in Satan's flower garden? Have you got an idea what a weed is like? And if our children were weeds in Satan's flower garden, what that would mean? How tough and resilient a weed is, how difficult to eradicate, how persistent and pernicious in creating its own space and dominating the area where it is. I can see our posterity being that way. An analogy is the thing I like to think in. I couldn't find those words formerly, but this is one of the analogies that I think about. Until we've created and defended the environment in ourselves, our family, our churches, community, nation, and the world that will protect and encourage the emergence of much larger numbers of the millennial child mentioned in Doctrine and Covenants, section 45. This last knowledge domain, the emergence and care for the millennial child, is my personal contribution to all this. I know the writing is rough, but I think there is value here. It has certainly blessed my life. I hope you will be able to find ways to look past my imperfections and find the blessings that are here for you and those you love. These, plus the sections on Grandpa's stories and my art, constitute my spiritual will. And so, I think I run out. I've reduced these things to scripts and to videos, and I'm posting them online. I have 2 right now that are being posted by YouTube, and this one I hope will join them today or tomorrow, and that will constitute the end of my project after all of these months and years. And I look forward to get back into my studio, do some painting and some wood carving, and do some of the things that I so much want to do. But I've been here before, and when I reported into the Lord, He said, yeah, that work is good so far, but what do you think it would be like? Couldn't people understand it better if there was a YouTube video to sort of explain it to them? There I went again. So I'm saying what I'm saying right now, but whether this is where I can ask for an honorable release from this work, I don't know. But I do know one thing: I intend to be faithful and to try to continue to minister for the Lord, to give Him a voice to His children, to help the Savior explain to you what it means to teach as Jesus teaches. If you master some of these things and approach Him, he will be able to talk to you in terms that you are now prepared to understand. Oh, I hope you have that opportunity and that experience. It's marvelous. I love you. I thank you. I appreciate you spending time with me.